I want to thank everybody for coming, and want to thank Skip Rutherford for being here tonight. Probably he doesn't need much of an introduction to anybody that's from Arkansas, but in case you don't know about Skip, Skip is the Dean of the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service, and he comes to that from a lot of experience. He was a key advisor during Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign and a big advisor to Clinton all along, and an administrative assistant to U.S. Senator David Pryor. He later received a lot of accolades, including being named Arkansan of the Year by both the Arkansas Times and the Arkansas Broadcasters Association for his work supervising Bill Clinton Presidential Center and Park. So we thank you, Skip, for all that wonderfulness that you brought to us here in Arkansas, and I will let you as moderator get us started on our program.
Thank you, Rayanne. Thanks for having me tonight. I'm honored to be here. I want to give a shout out to Hunter Sadler and the young professionals with the Arkansas State House Society for presenting tonight's program. It's really exciting to see young people engaged in history. So Hunter, thank you and your group for leading this effort, and we appreciate the sponsorship. As Carrie mentioned, you can ask your questions by chat, so please submit them at any time. I do ask that you get them in by 7:45 because we are going to end the program at 8 o'clock. So in the middle of the presentations, feel free to submit chat questions. As Betsy Jakeway has already given me a premier introduction, I knew that David Gofield was one of the very best, but Betsy's confirmation of that makes it very special that we have the Robert E. Bailey Professor of History at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, here with us tonight. He's a noted Southern historian and Pulitzer Prize nominated author, and he addresses politics and social discord. 9 days after the election, Dr. Gofield's old State House topic, American Politics in the Age of Polarization, historical perspective, could not be more timely. We're a little polarized today, David, and we're anxious to hear your presentation. Please welcome Dr. David Gofield.
Thank you very much, Skip. It's good to be with you all tonight. I wish I was there in person. I would like to also thank Rayanne Fields and Carrie Cox, and also the Young Professionals group of Hunter Sadler. We're going to talk about some history first, and then we're going to bring it up to the past 40 or 50 years up until the present. So I'm going to expand this and okay, y'all can see that now, I take it. American Politics in the Age of Polarization. Okay, great. We've been polarized before. I think when you're living through something, you always feel that this is a unique situation. It hasn't happened before, and absolutely. But in the 1850s, we were, in fact, a very divided nation. Nowadays, the divide is more by geography in terms of cities and suburbs versus small towns and rural areas. But the geography in the 1850s was more often north versus south. And there were two major issues in the 1850s, race and immigration. If that sounds familiar, well, we haven't really solved either yet. And of course, the racial issue that was central in the 1850s was the issue of slavery. In fact, it generated so much passion that a senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, was beaten to unconsciousness on the floor of the U.S. Senate in 1856, and it took him 3 years to recover and restore his seat in the U.S. Senate. But at the same time, there was a riot in the Congress, not the people coming in and causing trouble, but among the congressmen themselves. And you can see here a print from the February 5th, 1858 riot in Congress. The other issue in the 1850s that really exercised the population was immigration, particularly the immigration of Roman Catholics. The feeling was Roman Catholics would undermine and subvert American democracy. And here you see a cartoon by one of the leading cartoonists of American history, Thomas Nast. And you can see these crocodiles coming ashore, but they're not really crocodiles. If you look closely, they're prelates from the Roman Catholic Church, and they're coming to take the children. Now, in the distance, you'll see this St. Peter's Cathedral. But on the front of St. Peter's Cathedral, the inscription says Tammany Hall, which was the Democratic Party headquarters in New York. The idea was the Democratic Party was the party of immigrants. And the Republican Party was born, in effect, to combat the institution of slavery, particularly its extension into the territories, and secondly, to combat Roman Catholicism and immigration more generally. And as a result, many of our cities in the country at the time erupted into sectarian riots. Here you see one of the worst, which was immortalized in Martin Scorsese's film, Gangs of New York, the clash between Protestant and Catholic gangs in New York City in 1857. Well, the result of these clashes, both in terms of immigration and in terms of slavery, resulted in the splitting of the nation. And here you see a cartoon which depicts this very well. In the 1860 presidential election, 4 candidates ran with distinctly different platforms. Here we have Abraham Lincoln, Stephen A. Douglas, John Breckinridge representing the South, and John Bell as a sort of a compromise candidate representing the middle states. And here we see the election results from 1860. I know you all know by now that the red means Republican and blue means Democrat. But by the way, that was a function of NBC News in 1980. They figured everybody had a color TV, so let's make this in color. And they just assigned the Republicans red and the Democrats blue, and we've had them ever since. So in 1860, you can see here the divisions in the country. The South went all Democratic for John Breckinridge. Of course, Lincoln was not even on the ballot, at least in North Carolina, probably not in Arkansas either. And Lincoln swept the North and the far West, and John Bell got the border states. And Lincoln was elected with less than 40% of the vote. But as we all know, the popular vote doesn't necessarily guarantee you election. It's the Electoral College, and Lincoln at the time had the majority of electoral votes, 180 electoral votes. But keep these divisions in mind. In 1968, although we didn't go into civil war after 1968 presidential election as we did in 1860, we did have similar issues, particularly around the issue of race, around the Vietnam War, and the Democratic Party split again. George Wallace, who was successful in orienting the anti-integration vote and the law and order vote as well. And the Republican nominee, Richard Nixon, was successful in grabbing both of those issues in a much less confrontational way to secure the Republican nomination and eventually the presidency. Moving to the present, we have a divided electorate, a divided economy, and a devastating pandemic that has highlighted these deep divisions. But perhaps most troubling for our democracy, we are losing faith in our government, a process that has been ongoing for at least a generation. When a survey conducted by Working America, an affiliate of the AFL-CIO, prior to the 2018 midterm elections, asked over 4,000 respondents to name an elected official who was fighting for them, the top response was no one. How different it was not a very long time ago. In 1965, according to the Pew Research Center, 71% of Americans stated they trusted Washington most or all of the time. In 2019, Pew asked the same question. Only 17% of Americans trusted the government to do what was right most or all of the time. The loss of faith in our government reflects our loss of faith in each other. In the 2 decades after World War II, we rebuilt a nation scarred by depression and war. Government provided us with the tools to succeed in education, science and technology, civil rights, infrastructure, and medical care. Together, government, corporate America, and individual citizens collaborated to construct a nation and a people, proving that equality, prosperity, and democracy could not only coexist, but could thrive and strengthen each other. How can we restore this idea of commonwealth? How government can work for all of the people, and therefore how each of us can work for our country. There already exists a prototype of how we might accomplish this, because we did it during the 2 decades after 1945. Public policy addressed the educational, health, housing, economic, and environmental needs of Americans. In the process, these policies rapidly expanded the middle class and aided the government's bottom line. This is Harry Truman as a plowboy plowing his field in Missouri. Harry Truman didn't go to college, not because he was not educationally fit for college, because he couldn't afford it. Instead, he went to Kansas City, took a job at a bank, and got a roommate by the name of Arthur Eisenhower, who had a younger brother, Dwight Eisenhower, whom of course we all know. Although they disagreed on politics, of course the Eisenhowers were rock-ribbed Republicans, and Truman was a very loyal Democrat. They got along as roommates. And Truman eventually became senator from Missouri. And of course, as we all know, ascended 1945 after the death of Franklin Roosevelt. And one of Roosevelt's last bills that he supported was the GI Bill. Before World War II, relatively few Americans graduated from college. This changed dramatically when the GI Bill offered the opportunity of a higher education to millions of returning veterans and their families. They, and especially their offspring, would fill the jobs of the emerging post-industrial economy. The GI Bill grew a middle class that gobbled up new consumer products, thus expanding the economy further. It became what I call a virtuous circle. Government funding for education boosted the consumer economy, in turn raising tax revenues, which generated more educational and training programs, which boosted consumer spending, and so on. At the same time, immigration was a problem. You're looking at a girl. She looks like maybe 7, 8 years old. She's actually 11, but she had spent some time in a German concentration camp. Her name, Selma Moses. She lost all her family during World War II. She's sitting near the dock in Bremerhaven, Germany, waiting for a ship to take her to America. She eventually settled in Jacksonville, Florida. But she was one of the lucky ones because there was strong anti-immigrant sentiment that President Truman tried to overcome, because in 1946, the Republicans took control of Congress, and they wanted to limit immigration. And you see here this cartoon. Truman is asking, what happened to the one we used to have? Of course, Statue of Liberty, holding out her hand. No more. We have enough. We have enough. Race continued to be a problem in America. We're looking at a soldier who fought for America during World War II. His name is Isaac Woodard. And Woodard was discharged in Columbus, Georgia, Fort Benning, and made his way by Greyhound bus up to his home in South Carolina. And at one of the stops, got off, and instead of going to the colored waiting room, he said, well, you know, I put my life on the line for this country. I'm going to go to the white waiting room. He was arrested, beaten, and the sheriff gouged out his eyes. That's why he's wearing sunglasses. And if you think things up north were a lot better, not necessarily. This is Detroit, again in the 1940s. You've heard the phrase, build the wall. Well, neighborhoods in Detroit began building this wall that we see here to separate black neighborhoods from white neighborhoods. And down in Miami, they had that even stronger message for those African Americans who wanted to come into their neighborhood. And you can, I'm not going to read this. You can see this. You can see this for yourself. So in 1947, Truman signed an amazing document called To Secure These Rights. The idea was that America needed civil rights legislation. Of course, there was no way he was going to get that passed in Congress at the time, but he said that this was something that had to be talked about, and it was. For the first time, 1948 presidential election, for the first time since the Reconstruction era, civil rights and race relations were one of the, or two or three of the major issues in that political campaign. And of course, Truman was re-elected. Now, I have a confession to make, and I hope Skip Rutherford won't mind me saying this, but I think Dwight Eisenhower was probably, next to Franklin D. Roosevelt, probably the greatest president of the 20th century. And I say that because he's much underestimated. For those of you who may have seen him speak, he comes across a little bumbling, a little grandfatherly, but he was very bright. In 1946, of course, after World War II, he was the commanding general of the Allied forces during World War II. He got a letter from his brother Milton, who at the time was president of Kansas State University. And Milton asked him, look, I'm teaching a seminar. And I want to focus on the most important issue facing America today. This was in 1946. And Dwight Eisenhower wrote back to him and said, make it a course on race and race relations, because he felt that this was the most important aspect of American life at the time. And he followed through on this, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. In many ways, one of the ways was in Little Rock, Arkansas. And of course, I'm sure all of you know about Central High School and the integration. And I can just imagine those of you who may have heard or may have been in Little Rock at the time, when you heard the 101st Airborne Division march across that bridge and into Little Rock. It was the first time that the U.S. Army had entered the South in a fairly hostile way since the American Civil War. One of the things Eisenhower did was expand the government, particularly in terms of research. We date the National Institute of Health and a lot of these federal agencies that have generated research and scientific and medical development. And one of the beneficiaries of that was Dr. Jonas Salk, whom you see here. Up until the 1940s, when people got sick, there was relatively little doctors could do in terms of medication. By 1956, 80% of the drugs on the market had been developed since the previous decade, as antibiotics accelerated cures and reduced the threat of epidemics. We all know about that. By the 1960s, vaccines to control mumps, measles, and rubella came on the market, the fruits of government-funded research in the 1950s that Eisenhower had expanded. And of course, add to this the conquest of polio. These advances paid off in longer lives. By 1960, life expectancy had risen to 69.7 years. It was 62.9 years in 1940, just 20 years earlier. Government funding, particularly through the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, generated an array of scientific and technological breakthroughs. We became the world's laboratory and a synonym for invention and innovation. Now, these ideas and policies were mainstream in both the Democratic and Republican parties of that era. There was widespread understanding that government's role would change over time as society and the economy became increasingly complex. It was a vision of government as an agile and vigilant champion for its people. President Eisenhower, a Republican who led the nation during most of the 1950s, fully endorsed this perspective. His advocacy of civil rights, the undertaking of the largest public works project in American history, the interstate highway system, and his support of federal funding for tuition, research, and development expanded the footprint of government to meet the exigencies of the time. He believed that such interventions were essential for both the elevation of our citizens and our national security during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Yet Eisenhower always considered himself a moderate Republican, following the simple dictum of the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who said, "The legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all or cannot so well do for themselves in their separate and individual capacities." Eisenhower understood that the nation of the 19th century was not America of the 1950s, and what citizens required of their government had changed dramatically. The key phrase in Lincoln's statement was community of people. If the post-war presidents practiced what we call today identity politics, the identity was American, even on civil rights issues. And here we come to Lyndon B Johnson. Like Truman, Johnson grew, and Eisenhower, of course, grew up poor. He went to college for 1 year, couldn't afford his second year, and decided to become a teacher of this predominantly Mexican-American school in South Texas. And you see Johnson here, this is 1928 in the back row. Johnson, of course, presided over a tumultuous time in American history, the culmination, the apogee of the civil rights movement and the demonstrations connected with it. This, of course, is the conflict at Selma, Alabama, the march from Selma to Montgomery, the first march that never quite came off on March 7th, 1965. But on March 15th, 1965, President Johnson announced he would be forwarding a voting rights bill to Congress in response to the brutal attack on voting rights marchers in Selma, Alabama, a week earlier. Johnson framed the issue as a concern for all citizens. He said, "There is no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There is only an American problem. And we are met here tonight as Americans, not as Democrats or Republicans. We are met here as Americans to solve that problem." Among the greatest benefits of these post-war measures were a confident people and a confident nation. During the 1956 presidential campaign, the columnists Stuart and Joseph Alsop set out on a cross-country trip to assess the political climate. That President Eisenhower was popular among the voters was hardly a major scoop. But what impressed the Alsops most during their tour was, quote, how nice Americans are. They accounted for the graciousness as a reflection of the people's understanding confidence in the American future, an innate sense of personal equality, personal dignity, and personal freedom that transcended class and region. It was a confident nation, not only prosperous, but also of broadening inclusiveness. So there were obvious benefits to these post-war measures until the partnership between government and the American people began to fall apart. And we all know the culprits: an unpopular war, racial violence, the Arab oil embargo, Watergate, campus unrest, and an imploding industrial economy. For a nation that not only survived but thrived after experiencing economic depression and war, these setbacks should not have been so destabilizing. But in a bipartisan effort, our leaders tapped into the national malaise rather than attacking it, and found that dividing Americans and denigrated government paid high political dividends. The result of government bashing was a government that worked very well for the few, but left the many adrift. And I know many of you are Bill Clinton fans, and Clinton was elected to his first government position in Arkansas in 1976. I believe it was Attorney General, but maybe Skip can correct me if that's okay. Good. I'm right. And he got together with another young Democrat by the name of Gary Hart from Colorado, and they said we got to do something with the Democratic Party, particularly after the McGovern debacle of 1972. And he wanted to move the party closer to the center, and particularly he understood that we were entering a knowledge economy, and he wanted to go after the more educated voters, and he felt that the Republican Party had pretty much co-opted the white working class for some time to come, particularly on the issue of race. So this really sets the stage for not only Bill Clinton, but particularly in 1980 for the election of Ronald Reagan. Of course, the earliest evidence of this was Jimmy Carter's election in 1976. And I will tell you, I worked Jimmy Carter's campaign in Virginia in 1976. He turned out to be one of the worst presidents we've had, but he was just a super person, and he still is a super person. He's probably the best post-president we've ever had. Just a neat guy, but he just didn't cut it as president. And what we got was Ronald Reagan, who was proud of saying that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And you see what happens. See how much better things are without the heavy hand of government. We got skyrocketing airfares, air pollution, and acid rain, monster takeovers, nuclear plants, consumer protection is out the window, so is job safety, and water pollution. It was not much different from Bill Clinton's celebratory declaration in 1996 that, quote, the era of big government was over. But that wasn't quite true. Privileged individuals and organizations were very much plugged into federal policy. The rest of us were not. The fallout reflected this imbalance. 90% of Americans have experienced decline or stagnation in their incomes over the past 30 years. And this has been a bipartisan effort. I'm not beating on Republicans, I'm not beating on Democrats, I'm beating on both of them. Today, according to Nobel laureate economist Joseph Stiglitz, the US has the highest level of income inequality among developed nations and among the lowest levels of upward mobility. The disparity would matter less were it not for the fact that rising college tuition, burgeoning home prices, skyrocketing healthcare costs, and the price of most consumer goods have eroded middle-class savings, middle-class opportunities, the size of the middle class itself. Corporate concentration, abetted by the weakening of antitrust enforcement, has further exacerbated the price squeeze, stifling something we used to be great at, innovation and invention. Corporate leaders find it more immediately profitable to plow back profits to shareholders rather than to invest in research and development. At the same time, the federal government safety net has shredded. As one economist recently noted, for Americans under the age of 40, the 21st century has resembled one long recession. Once a global leader in providing opportunities for its citizens, the US has fallen far, far behind the rest of the developed world in supporting families with paid parental leave, early childhood education, and job training programs, particularly in those areas suffering from a transitioning economy. Now, sure, there are other factors beyond public policy creating this crisis, including globalization. But nations like Germany, Sweden, and Denmark, with relatively high public social service costs, have weathered these developments and have prospered without the deep and despairing economic dislocation the US has experienced. Globally, we have slid far down the list of developed nations. According to UNICEF, the US ranks 37th among countries in the well-being of our children. American infants are 76% more likely to die than children in other. We could mount programs to address these issues for about $100 billion annually. That's a large sum. But in the meantime, the lost productivity generated by our neglect of these children amounts to $800 billion annually. We're the only advanced nation without national legislation guaranteeing paid maternity leave, the only advanced nation not to guarantee workers any vacation, paid or unpaid, and the nation with the lowest minimum wage. Here you have paid maternal leave almost everywhere, except for Liberia and Papua New Guinea. That's a great club to be a member of. Yes, labor unions are weaker in the US, but the government has also withdrawn its protection. We live in an era of reduced expectations, and that has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But we can fix this. We should be optimistic, guardedly, but optimistic still. Our greatest resource remains us, the citizens. The extent of organizing in cities, states, towns across the nation has been prodigious. The nation still has good bones. Despite the growing economic and social inequality, America today is more inclusive than it was in 1945. Better off for women, for African Americans, for gays, and for all who share in the belief that expanding freedom for one expands freedom for all. What is missing, and has been for 4 decades, is a good federal government ensuring opportunity for the greatest number as opposed to the relatively few. The key commonality about federal policy in the 2 decades after World War II was its universality. Policies that helped the entire nation, even if initiatives such as civil rights legislation targeted a particular group. Post-war legislation empowered collective structures such as state universities, interstate highways, collective bargaining, and Medicare. Progressive taxation spurred growth. In 1949, the top income bracket paid a marginal tax rate of 82%, a rate that barely budged during the Eisenhower administrations of the 50s. In 2019, that figure was 37%. The failures that led to our current situation shouldn't lead to an overall indictment of the institution of government. The issue is not big government versus small government. The issue is good government. Politicians have fanned anti-government sentiment not only for political gain, but also to satisfy their financial supporters. And voters know this. In 1964, 29% of voters believed that the government was run by a few big interests. By 2013, that was up to 79%. The record is clear. The US has prospered in times of broad government activism. The nation has faltered when it has failed to live up to its people. I just want to stress 2 final things. First, there are policies that can lift the people and a nation because many of them have already worked. Second, we can do much better individually when we are together. The policies that once made Americans great remain the blueprint for our revival. But this is 2020 and not 1956. We have moved firmly into the knowledge economy. Our society is more diverse than at any time since 1910. We are defined and divided less by regional differences than by settlements, metropolitan, suburban, small town, and rural environments. The common denominator between then and now, however, must be investment in our people, infrastructure projects, investments in basic research, the extension of voting rights protections, progressive taxation, environmental investments, enforcement of antitrust laws, affordable higher education, and immigration reform were all policies that prevailed during the 2 decades after the end of the Second World War. They succeeded in forging a more equitable nation by enabling its citizens to succeed. Post-war Americans confronted new social, economic, and global landscapes, as we do. And an active and inclusive government not only eased the transition, but capitalized on it. Presidents Eisenhower and Johnson in particular understood this. We need to do that today, renewing the investments in our citizens as we did a half century ago. We need an updating, not an upheaval. Add to the post-war agenda family-friendly policies such as paid family leave, and the result will be a nation better able to compete in the 21st century, as well as to provide a positive legacy for our children and grandchildren. Now, please, forgive me for this indulgence, but this is my granddaughter, Abigail, and I want to leave her a world that was at least as good as when I was her age and growing up. It is a patriotic agenda that puts all Americans first and preserves our patrimony. It's neither a conservative nor a liberal agenda. It is a common sense program, literally tried and true to make Americans great again. Can we afford it? Good question. Somehow, in a much less affluent nation following the greatest economic depression in our history and the enormous costs of fighting a world war, we did all of these things and more. Now, in a wealthier country with a better educated population, we ought to be doing even better. And that will generate a common purpose. Our post-war presidents followed a key principle laid down by our first president, George Washington, in his farewell address. He said, "Citizens must indignantly frown upon the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which now link together the various parts." Our nation's motto, after all, is E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. Thank you very much.
And David, thank you. I always love a walk through history by someone who understands it, and you have done a wonderful job in explaining that. Let me refer to a question that was asked that talks about, do you think the polarization and populist distrust that we've seen over history, do you think that's the rule rather than the exception?
Could you repeat that? I'm having some difficulty.
All right. What is that? Do you think the polarization and the populist distrust that we've had in government over the years throughout history has become the rule, more distrust than the exception?
No, I don't. But I can understand Donald Trump's victory in 2016, because neither of the two political parties for about the previous 40 to 50 years really paid much attention to anybody except their major donors. In 1992 Republican convention, Pat Buchanan gave a seconding speech for George H.W. Bush, who was being renominated. He didn't say anything about George H.W. Bush, but he talked about these two Americas and the working people and how they've been ignored. It's that, and George Wallace made the same comments back in the 1960s. So that has increasingly been a theme. And neither of the two major parties really have addressed that until 2016, when Donald Trump came along and underscored it and emphasized it.
Are you let me see, I think David are you with us, David?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, good. I couldn't really tell. Okay, the next question is, what about the role of the cable talk shows, social media, the access that people have to information that tends to whether the information is true or not, but it certainly tends to separate people in terms of camps and so forth. What kind of role is that playing to the kind of government that you have just advocated that America needs?
That is a significant difference between now and 50 years ago, where we all seem to be in our little silos, or big silos, as the case may be. And cable TV and the internet have only fragmented this even more. But we have had periods in American history when Americans have been divided, but we've had leadership that has pulled us together. Franklin D. Roosevelt did it in the 1930s. Truman did it in the 1940s. Eisenhower did it in the 1950s. We were quite a divided nation in the 1950s. If you remember the McCarthy, not remember personally, but if you remember in the 1950s, we had McCarthy hearings, and that was extremely divisive. So we've had these periods, but we also have had leadership. And that's one of the things that we have lacking. And I know you're close to Bill Clinton, but to my mind, between 1980 and 2016, we really did not have a government for the people, by the people.
So in this, although I think some people may take exception to that, just
I'm sure that's the case,
which is fine, but that's okay. You're a historian and I'm not, and I appreciate your comments. But I do want to talk about the sort of divided government, and David Brooks of the New York Times, right after the election, was talking about Joe Biden winning, but was also talking about how the Republicans had a good election, that they actually gained seats in the House, they held the Senate, they didn't lose any state legislatures. I mean, for the most part, Trump lost and the Republicans won, which was interesting, separating Trump from the Republicans in the election. But he wrote this, which I would like to get your comments on. It's not policies that cost Democrats. The core Biden policies are astoundingly popular. It's that they've built a cultural blue wall that keeps the other half of the country out, no matter the circumstance. How do you respond to that?
I think that has some merit. I really do. Of course, here in North Carolina, I meet numbers of people who don't like Democrats. And the feeling seems to be that they're looking down on us. They don't understand us. They don't understand our problems. They're elitists, which is interesting because the Republican Party was once characterized as the party of big money, but now both parties are the party of big money. And you can see the attraction of Donald Trump. If you go back to his campaign in 2015 and 2016, you will see this populist rhetoric that has surfaced from time to time, not only in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that for Truman, Eisenhower, and Johnson to a lesser degree, the party system was very different. We had four political parties in the 40s and 50s and part of the 60s. We had a conservative Republican Party, a moderate Republican Party, We had a conservative Democratic Party, and we had a liberal Democratic Party. And every 4 years they came together, but in between in legislation, that's how the civil rights legislation was passed. It was passed on coalitions. But now you have a political party system, basically two political parties, and they don't talk to each other. They're not comparable to each other, and there needs to be a bridge. And maybe Joe Biden can be that bridge, because he grew up in an era when, going to talk and maybe having lunch with James Eastland, even though their views were diametrically opposed, might have been a good thing, because sometimes we devolve our opponents into things rather than human beings.
You mentioned, you quoted LBJ and said, we don't have a Southern problem, we have an American problem.
Right.
As clearly one of his more notable remarks about trying to unify the country. Do you think history will look back on the Biden election and his commentary that there are no red states or blue states, but United States of America? Do you think he's trying to craft that same unity image that LBJ and Dwight Eisenhower and others that you have cited?
That's an interesting point, Skip, because if you go back and look at Obama's inauguration speech, first inauguration speech back in 2008, he said exactly the same thing. And of course, then we had the Tea Party and basically a government that didn't function very well. So we've had this theme before. Whether Biden can pull it off or not in a divided government, it's likely going to be a divided government. It really remains to be seen. I'm
okay,
still. Yeah, go ahead.
We got a final question, but I want to get it in. As a historian, and I know it's too early to write history, how's history going to look at Donald Trump?
In two ways, at least. One, that his election in 2016 reflected basic problems in American society that the two major political parties had not addressed for 40 or 50 years. And secondly, that his administration further polarized the nation and was destructive of our alliances abroad. And I think those are two of the objectives of the Biden administration, to restore our credibility and our alliances abroad, and to tone down the rhetoric and at least make an attempt to bridge the gaps that exist in American society.
David, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for being part of this event at the Old State House. And so we very much appreciate it. I want to again say thanks to Rayanne and Carrie and all those with the Old State House for putting this together. Hunter and the group with the young professionals, the Arkansas State Society, for sponsoring it. Tonight's program has been recorded. Will be posted on the Facebook pages of the Old State House and the Arkansas State Society, you can reach out to the Old State House to get further information. And I want to say that look, one of the things we can do is support the Old State House. So if you can, let me put in a plug to donate, to help. History is important. Telling the story is important. And the Old State House is important. When you talked about Sumner being killed or attacked on the Senate floor, I thought of the first legislative session in Arkansas in the Old State House, where we had a Bowie knife fight and a member died. If you don't know that story, David, it's a good one, and Revis Edmonds can tell you all about it. But I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Old State House. Thank you, Hunter. And David, you were excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Good night, everyone.